Well, I'm going to talk about the Syrian uprising, revolution, and civil war. I'm not going to look at what's happening today. I'm going to look at. Can you hear me?
Any chance you could stand up?
Yes, I can stand up. Yeah, certainly. I'm not going to talk about what's happening today.
Is there a microphone?
Is there a microphone?
Yeah.
I don't think there is, unfortunately.
Can you hear me clearly enough?
Yes.
Yeah.
Difficult.
Okay, I'll speak even. I'll try and project.
At the front, if somebody's finding it difficult, you're very welcome to come and sit down here.
Dara, near the Jordanian border in March 2011, when security forces reacted violently towards peaceful anti-government protests, firing upon civilians and killing many. These demonstrations represented an outpouring of discontent against Bashar al-Assad's government from across the spectrum of Syrian society and its many religious communities. It soon spread to larger towns and cities, morphing into an armed insurgency. The struggle for Syria then has devastated much of the country and its cities, killed over 250,000 people and left millions internally displaced, and provoked the worst refugee crisis since the Second World War. The conflict has spilled over into neighbouring countries, Lebanon, Iraq, Jordan, Turkey, prompted the intervention of regional rivals in Saudi Arabia and Turkey and Iran, leading to a proxy war in Syria, and provoked military intervention by the US and its allies, not in support of the opposition, but against the emergent Islamist forces after 2014, and subsequently Russian military intervention in aid of the regime. From the outset, Syria's government viewed the conflict as the culmination of a Western siege, a siege that waxed and waned through former US President George W. Bush's tenure, only to intensify again after the Arab uprisings of 2010-11. Assad framed this uprising as a war against his response to the uprising as a conflict against foreign-backed opposition forces who were dominated by radical jihadi offshoots of Al-Qaeda, those seeking to carve out a state from the Sunni hinterlands of what was Ba'athist and Syria and Iraq. And that served a sectarian narrative that he developed throughout the course of the conflict. Sectarian identity did become a primary driver in the civil war, but this was not the case in 2011. The regime tactically and cleverly manipulated the sectarian variable in its drive to maintain Alawi Asabiyya and the support of other minority groups, presenting them with a Hobson's choice. Now, former Syrian President Hafez al-Assad, he went to great lengths to ensure that Syria's political system was not viewed or not seen explicitly or primarily in terms of Alawite minority rule. Nevertheless, this is exactly how many of those mobilizing within the majority community against Bashar's more overtly Alawite regime viewed it, and this can be seen in the sectarian polemical discourse and anti-Alawi imagery that they use. Somebody can have my seat if they want it. I'm standing up. And by labelling the armed opposition groups terrorists, jihadi and takfiri, and falling back on the powerful pro-Iranian Lebanese Shia militia Hezbollah for military support in Syria, Bashar took a fateful decision in facilitating sectarian narratives and counter-narratives. For in doing so, he was completely ignoring the legitimate socio-economic and political concerns and grievances of the protesters within the opposition movement, and intentionally exposing his own community to the reductionist logic of those Islamist forces and their mutually reinforcing propaganda drowned out in time the secular modern discourse of the Syrian National Council when it emerged. Consequently, the prevalence of ISIS in 2014 saw the West shift its focus from applying pressure on the regime to halting the advance of radical Islamists in both Syria and Iraq. The regime was consistently aggressive in rallying the Alawi community behind it, while the conflict more generally became a textbook case of what sociologists describe as sectarian and ethnic boundary activation, the heightening of awareness of perceived differences between members of the in-group and members of the out-group in a deeply divided society. Being Alawi in contemporary Syria meant being part of a network that facilitated social mobility, political opportunity and economic advancement. This had negative social consequences for the Assad regime, as it led many of its opponents to harbour deep-seated political and socio-economic grievances towards the Alawi community as a whole, and these rise to the surface whenever the conflict and civil war is in full swing. Now, often these were class-based rather than religious animosities. Yet, as in any deeply divided society characterised by ethnic, tribal or religious schisms, these were felt and articulated through Syria's sectarian cleavages, and in recent times activated by the Syrian Uprising and provoked by the regime's zero-sum and brutal authoritarian response to that uprising. So in this lecture, what I'm going to try and do in the next 50 minutes is going to detail and analyse a number of the key factors that led to this civil war, address the question of how and why the regime has survived the conflict so far, albeit in a fairly weakened state, and look briefly at some of the salient international variables that have led to what we might describe as something of the first real stalemate, which is not necessarily a bad thing. So firstly, I want to consider why the Syrian uprising or revolutionary movement happened and provide some historical context by which to answer this question. When he came to power, Hafez al-Assad set out to manipulate and harness Syria's heterogeneous population around a coherent authoritarian centre by building a state that was secular, nationalist and integrationist, a state that would comprise all sections of society, that posed no religious or nationalist opposition or ideological threat to his rule. And he dealt with opponents to that project utterly ruthlessly. Why? The Syria that Hafez had grown up in was an unstable, coup-prone, divided state in which no government lasted particularly long before the Ba'ath Party came to office in a coup. And he set out to ensure that Syria, contemporary Syria, was coup-proof. His rule through the Syrian Ba'ath Party was not simply a facade for an Alawi state, nor did he preside over a minority regime that governed through the complete exclusion of the majority community from office. He tried to govern with a degree, although he wielded absolute power, he tried to govern with a degree of consensus that would allow for that facade to consolidate and for Syria to consolidate. And this marks an important distinction from the regime of his son Bashar, as Hafez al-Assad co-opted key figures from Syria's Sunni community, from the majority community, into his government through the Ba'ath Party, and this was particularly important. He consolidated his authority by de-radicalizing, ideologically de-radicalizing the Ba'ath Party, absorbing many of its powers within the presidency and reorganising Syria's army and intelligence services and security apparatus, and bringing all of those things firmly under Alawi control. Domestically, then the network of Alawi loyalists he established across the governing party and security services were pivotal to his success in transforming Syria into a regional power of some significance, consolidating his rule and consolidating Arab nationalist Syria. To garner domestic and regional legitimacy, Hafez sought to assume the mantle of Arab nationalist leadership after Egyptian President Anwar Sadat entered a peace process with Israel following the 1973 Arab-Israeli War. And this in some ways made amends for Syria's rather catastrophic performance during the 1967 Arab-Israeli War, when Hafez was at the helm in the Ministry of Defence. Lacking a natural constituency amongst the majority Sunni community, Assad then set out to fashion his Arab nationalist credentials out of a personality cult forged through the state-controlled media and by maintaining Syria's resistance status in the Arab-Israeli conflict. He confronted the US and Israel as a Soviet ally during the Cold War. He rejected peace with Israel to sustain the Arab-Israeli conflict. He dominated Lebanon and the PLO and manipulated them to his own agenda, and furthering his irredentist claim towards Lebanon and greater Syrian nationalism. He sided with the US against Iraq after the invasion of Kuwait when the Cold War comes to an end, and then he allies with Syria with revolutionary Iran in that post-Cold War period. So he was very successful in maximising what was often, for Syria, what was often a very narrow negotiating position in international relations, and consolidating a state with meagre natural resources, certainly comparatively to some of his neighbours, such as Iraq, few allies, and an abundance of enemies in the regional and international system. If the presidency, the army, and the Ba'ath Party were the key pillars of government in supporting Hafez's authoritarian rule, then greater Syrian nationalism was the syncretistic identity of the state that tied it all together, a rubric encompassing confessional, ethnic, and tribal loyalties, and the Kurds and Islamists fell outside that rubric. Not unlike Tito, Hafez repressed ethnic and religious identities under a pan-nationalist secular umbrella, a state ideology from which the government derived much of its legitimacy. And although Syria became highly dependent on the doctrine of Baathism, the Alawi community remained at the forefront of every aspect of political and social life under Hafez. Thus, Hafez never gained the domestic, anything near the domestic or international legitimacy that Tito enjoyed under the non-aligned movement, nor could he resolve the fact that he was overly dependent on that Alawi community in a truncated Syrian state, which many nationalist and Islamist ideologues viewed as an artificial hangover from the days of European colonialism. Principally, Assad's legitimacy deficit was due to his reliance on that community, but nevertheless, by the 1990s, Syria appeared to be a more durable and coherent state than it had been at any time since independence from the French. So the state that Hafez built consolidated on the foundations of Syrian Arab nationalism, and despite its deficiencies, the nationalist outpouring displayed on the streets at the start of 2011 mark out and remind us of just how successful Hafez was in that nation state building project. Syria was not a state that was on the brink of collapse. In the decade before Tito's death, Slovenes, Croats, Bosniaks came to identify less and less with the Yugoslav state, for example. And under Bashar al-Assad's first 10 years in power, it was the government and not the state that lacked widespread public support in Syria. Syria's collapse, in contrast to Yugoslavia, was not the result of ethno-national forces encroaching upon a weakening authoritarian central state. The disintegration of Syria actually occurred against the grain of both regime and opposition efforts and desires to maintain the state and dominate it as a whole. Similar to Ba'athist Iraq, Assad's Syria was always dependent on an authoritarian centre, susceptible to accusations of minority rule, vulnerable to the divisions manipulated by colonial powers, and dependent on a confrontational foreign policy for its survival. When the French unified the country under the Mandate period, support for and identification with Arabism and religious communal affiliations were far more evident amongst the Syrian population than any attachment to the notion or idea of an emergent Syrian nation. And the manipulation of sub-state identities under Hafez through the Ba'ath Party, Alawi solidarity, and the failure of pan-Arabism were thus instrumental to Syrian state consolidation. I mention these things because they have fundamentally unravelled, and I cannot imagine that they could possibly be put back together in a future Syria. More than that, it is ironic, perhaps, that the country collapsed into civil war, as Syria was a far more integrated society. When Hafez came to power, a distinctly Arab Syrian identity existed, and the vast majority of people viewed themselves as Syrian, something that probably could not quite be said similarly of Saddam Hussein's Iraq in 2003. Nevertheless, given the regime's increasing legitimacy deficit and continued alignment with revolutionary Iran in the post-Hafez period, it was not at all surprising that the post-2011 struggle for Syria pitted the regime against a plethora of domestic, regional and international actors and adversaries. Perhaps civil war in Syria was not inevitable, but a decade ago the cracks were evident in those key pillars that I have described of Hafez al-Assad's state. Firstly, in 2005, Syria's vulnerability was exposed on the international stage when Bashar al-Assad suffered a humiliating defeat and a reversal of fortunes in Lebanon. The Syrian military forces that had occupied Lebanon since 1976, invited in by the Maronites to save them from the PLO, were forced to withdraw after Lebanon's Saudi-backed former Prime Minister Rafiq Hariri was spectacularly assassinated by car bomb in Beirut on Valentine's Day in 2005. What follows is intense Western pressure then and an anti-Syrian uprising, and this results in an abrupt end to the Assad regime's hegemonic control, and probably also an end to its irredentist claim to Lebanon. Now, this represents a significant weakening of Syria's regional standing. Lebanon was the trump card in Hafez's Middle East foreign policy. Defeat for its son in Lebanon marked a considerable loss of military prestige. It showed to Syrians and to Lebanese that the regime was not all powerful, and it could be damaged, and this had a deep impact on the regime's greater Syrian nationalist credentials. It contrasts in the period after this, and retreats. Western pressure on the Assad regime then intensified. It had already started, but it intensified over the next 2 years. Deemed a rogue state by George W. Bush on his axis of evil. The US points the finger of blame for the Hariri killing at Damascus and accuses Bashar of supporting an anti-Western insurgency in Iraq by allowing Salafi jihadists to leave prison and slip across the border to fight against the United States. And this is something that the US didn't forgive. The pressure began to alleviate, however, in 2007 when the US begins to give up in Iraq and cut its losses. And the US ends the diplomatic isolation of Syria, which has a siege that Syria has been under since the Al-Qaeda attacks on America. In early 2011, and what turned out to be an ill-timed move, they renewed diplomatic relations with Syria, but Obama then renews sanctions imposed by his predecessor in 2004 after the Dera protests and the regime's clampdown, and this signals an end to the regime's short-lived détente with the United States. So why did this coup-proof state that I've described and that Hafez built begin to collapse and Syria fragment? Well, when anti-authoritarian protests swept the region in 2010-11, it was class-based socio-economic grievances that fueled Syrian opposition towards a regime that was viewed as overtly Alawi, ostentatiously corrupt, and brutally authoritarian. From the outset of the uprising, Bashar had no credible political reform agenda with which to contain or regulate the protests, protests which represented the most threatening challenge to the Assad regime since the early 1980s with the Muslim Brotherhood's insurgency. His failure to advance the Syrian state-building project and the country's descent into civil war was in part a consequence of his father's inability to emulate his father's successful foreign policy. And that's a criticism, but it certainly wasn't easy. These were not easy times in which he inherited by accident the presidency. Equally importantly, where Hafez governed with the support of the Ba'ath Party and with the army's backing, wielded absolute power from the presidency, Bashar's efforts to consolidate political authority against the conservative old guard of his father's regime led him to fall back on coercion and to fall back on the Alawi community and Alawi solidarity. Internally, the facade of Syrian political pluralism, which I spoke of, collapsed in the years after he assumed office. The Ba'ath Party's significance waned, and the regime tapered towards an Alawi familial, tribal, and communitarian base. Tellingly, by 2005, he had disposed of the most prominent linchpins, Sunni linchpins of his father's government, replacing them with a new generation of Alawi loyalists. And this may partly explain, in fact, the regime's resilience and cohesion during the early years of the civil war, and cohesion which, for the most part, exists today. In the absence of what occurred in Tunisia and Egypt, I think it's highly unlikely that the 2011 protests in Syria would have, on their own, led to a revolutionary movement that resulted in state fragmentation and the ascendancy of a radical Islamist state-building project. Had Bashar al-Assad empowered the bourgeois elites of Aleppo and Damascus after the international siege ends in 2007 and 2008 and opened up the system to some form of political pluralism, real political pluralism, then the opposition may have gained a stake in the regime and consolidated some of its interests to the regime. But I don't mean to overstate that suggestion. Conversely, having removed the key figures of his father's government from office and resorted to consolidating power through a dictatorial Alawi clique, Assad must have feared that any significant or real or tangible political reforms would have exposed him further to what were real and threatening internal and external threats. So after the period of intense debate over political reform in Syria, following Hafez al-Assad's death, known as the Damascus Spring of 2000-2001, the regime chose then to suppress rather than to accommodate calls for political reform and social change. So a decade later, in completely different international and regional circumstances, which were much, much more challenging, the regime was even less inclined to contemplate political reform, attempting political reform. It was well equipped to counter militant opposition, but far less so equipped to engage with the civil opposition's demands for political reform. So from the outset, unsurprisingly then, it opted to provoke militancy. It handled the protests very, very badly, and having failed to crush the opposition in the early months of the uprising, it took the choice, it chose conflict. It quickly framed the conflict as a confrontation between terrorists and the state, moved to shore up Alawi support, and constructed a counter-insurrection narrative that depicted the opposition movement as an affront for a radical sectarian agenda against the secular Arab nationalist Syria and all those that would be disenfranchised in a Sunni Islamist state. Between 2001 and 2010, it is highly unlikely, I think, that Bashar could have introduced political reform and at the same time consolidated his rule by enhancing his domestic support base. The legitimacy deficit from which his father's regime suffered had exponentially increased, and in the absence of Soviet support, he was internationally weak and increasingly reliant on Iran. And Iran was not very popular on the international scene, to put it mildly, during this period. Compounding these difficulties, these political difficulties, his tenure comes at a turning point historically for the Middle East. Al-Qaeda terrorist attacks on the US in 2001 lead to an assertion, a rather radical assertion of US power, a reversal of US realism towards the region, and this had a dramatic impact on Syria. While Hafez had faced considerable challenge, and challenges from the Muslim Brotherhood between 76 and 82, funded and supported by his great rival Saddam Hussein, and an attempted coup in 1985 led by his own brother Rafat. With the support of the Soviets, he was able to advance, balance and maintain Syria's position as a frontline state, resistant state in the Arab-Israeli conflict. Now this brought him significant political and financial dividends from the Gulf during the last 2 decades of the Cold War, when Egypt had left Syria and made peace with Israel. And this is a particularly significant point in terms of how Hafez survived. When the Soviet Union collapsed then, Hafez switches track by joining the anti-Arab-Israeli peace process and supporting the Western anti-Saddam front after he invades Kuwait. This détente with the West ends abruptly then after 9/11, forcing Bashar to forge ever closer links with Iran, the very state that the US sought to contain and curtail through its invasion of Iraq. From the perspective of the Bush administration, this put Arab nationalist secular Ba'athist Syria on the wrong side of history. Domestic oil revenue and those financial windfalls from the Gulf that I spoke of, in lieu of Syria's frontline status in the Arab-Israeli conflict after Camp David and its response to the First Gulf War, enabled Hafez to finance the regime's entourage and Syria's social networks, fund states, the Alawi social networks, fund state subsidies, and provide basic welfare for the Syrian people. Life wasn't nice under Hafez in Syria, but there was a sort of equality of misery or poverty with the social safety net where the vast majority of people coexisted. Although Syria was largely free from the burden of foreign debt, there was no significant economic windfall from east or west with which to bolster Bashar's position after he took office. Drought, dwindling oil reserves, and the introduction of a liberal economic reform programme which Hafez had considered as far back as the 1970s upended the social contract upon which the regime derived much of its support. Consequently, these economic reforms soon digressed into crony capitalism, and they had a deep impact on Syrian society, and that came at the expense of weakening the key pillars of the regime. Yet these reforms seemed unavoidable, given the massive, enormous demographic expansion that Syria experienced in recent decades, and migration to Syria's cities. The economic reforms were not without merit, but they rapidly increased those socioeconomic inequalities in Syria. No social support network was in place to ease Syria's transition towards becoming a market economy. A new class of corrupt business elites thrived, and the state's withdrawal from the social pact, under which food and fuel products were heavily subsidised, hurt the poorest in the countryside and also in the cities. So while Hafez had depended on Alawi solidarity in the military and covered through the Ba'ath, Bashar was forced then to consolidate his rule around these business elites and this clique, concentrating power as he faced down the obstructionism of the old and notables of the Ba'ath party. So why has the regime survived, and how can we explain its survival? Today the Syrian government is only in control, and this is a rough figure, of approximately about 20% of the Syrian territory. It will never regain control over all of it, and it's wholly reliant on its Russian patron and the support of Iran and Hezbollah and militias that are beyond its control as well. Yet about 60 to 70% of the population, the country's remaining population, live under the regime, and with the support of Russia on the ground and at the UN Security Council, it is alive and kicking. At the outset of the conflict, moderate opposition discourse fell back on the cohesive myth that Syria was a unified nation. There was no sectarian conflict. There was no discord between its different religious and ethnic communities, and a post-Syrian democratic Syria would remain nationalist, secular, and integrated. Given the expression of Syrian nationalism at this point, this movement initially gained traction and convinced many not only was the regime's demise inevitable, but that there was a moderate political force in Syria's civil society that was capable of replacing the regime and bettering it with Western support. It was not very long, however, after violent conflict erupts before confessional identity, manipulated by the regime, becomes the lowest common denominator between the individual and the state. And fear is a primary driving factor in that. Despite the great display of Syrian nationalism and Alawi in the opposition and other confessional groups, once the regime retreated from the Kurdish areas in the north of the country and the conflict moved to Homs to Aleppo, the incompleteness of the Syrian nation, the state-building project, was exposed. Its communal, tribal, and ethnic divisions were exacerbated, and the sum of all its parts began to scatter and to fragment. Making concessions to the Kurds, the regime was shrewd in driving a wedge between them and the moderate, secular, mainstream Sunni opposition, which enabled it to free up military and resources from those areas. Lacking robust Western support, when the secular opposition was pared back and the constitutional certainty that the regime provided was challenged by a revanchist Islamist threat, enough Syrians, despite Assad's deep unpopularity and his regime's evident vulnerability, either out of loyalty, fear, or both, looked at him as the slightly lesser of two evils. Mindful of the recent experiences of civil war in Iraq and civil war in Lebanon, each Syrian community harboured fears that the state to which it formed a composite part might collapse in a similar fashion, were they to openly oppose the regime. And the influx of foreign fighters exacerbates this problem. And this is a very significant factor in accounting for the regime's resilience and its Machiavellian ability to maintain a very high degree of Alawi solidarity and attract other socio-economic and minority, I hate that word, but confessional groups to maybe not support it, but to acquiesce in its existence for their own interests. The regime's supporters began to argue that they were fighting to preserve a nationalist and secular state against a foreign-backed sectarian throwback force. The position they took was really simple. Unless the regime maintains steadfast, Sunni Islamists will overthrow the state, invoke Ibn Taymiyyah's fatwa against the Nusayri community, the Alawi, ethnically cleanse minority communities that are unwilling to convert to Islam, and institute an Islamic state. Reductionist propaganda, but effective. Now, with respect to social mobilisation, it could be argued that the regime's brutal response to the protests in 2011 in Syria's cities and towns undermined its own legitimacy. Cognizant of its vulnerability and those determined to exploit its weaknesses, both internally and externally, the regime formed absolutely no grandiose strategy or course to politically address the crisis. It did not bend to any pressure. It was unbendable or endeavour to resolve the crisis internationally. Its civil war strategy was simply to survive. Militarily, at any cost, bind itself to the Alawi community, and in doing so, it set out to hold Syria's cities and Mediterranean coastal strip through regime cohesion and uncompromising foreign policy. It could not defend Syria's enormous borders with Turkey and Iraq and Jordan, and it didn't waste a great deal of resources in trying to do so. But Lebanon was a different matter. Tactically, it maintained maximum flexibility by taking an incremental ad hoc approach to regional and international developments as they evolved, while employing the full range of political and military options at its disposal, including brinkmanship. Now, perhaps the most obvious example of the latter is the Ghouta chemical weapons attack in August 2013 and the international fallout and repercussions for the Syrian civil war. This horrendous war crime was actually a turning point in the civil war. Irrespective of who ordered the chemical weapons attack, the use of chemical weapons against civilians in Damascus exposed the West's deep apprehensions over making a military commitment to intervene in Syria's civil war. More than that, it confirmed what many observers had suspected since the onset of civil war. US policy towards Syria was to have no firm or consistent basis, so as to ensure that it avoided military intervention and avoided political responsibility. Whoever ordered the attack and consequently threw down the gauntlet to the West took a calculated risk. In the event the West backed down, and the regime's subsequent decision to open Syria up to UN weapons inspections, decommissioning program considerably widened its political traction internationally at the behest of Russia, illustrated its tactical astuteness, and saw the civil war take a different course from that point onwards. It marked an end to a period, if you remember, of intense Western pressure on Assad to leave office. There was practically nothing else on the international news during that and up to that period apart from media messages and propaganda against Assad. And it preempted a reversal of fortunes in this international propaganda war over Syria as Islamists from that point come to dominate the opposition. And this served the regime's purpose. The incident also revealed something about the structure of power in the regime and how successful it was in maintaining solidarity and cohesion. Lacking his father's standing, Bashar was a figurehead in what might be described as a dictatorial regime rather than a dictatorship, a one-man rule. Paradoxically, despite the fact that Syria's authoritarian centre weakened after he took office, this fragmentation of power did not prevent the regime from maintaining unity and avoiding the level of internal dissent that one might have expected, and one might have expected to trigger a coup or significant levels of high levels of dissension or desertion from the upper echelons of the regime to the opposition. In fact, the regime actually appeared to have eradicated internal dissent, and for the most part, by the summer of 2012, weeks prior to a bomb attack at the heart of the Damascus security establishment, which killed Bashar's brother-in-law and two top generals. He informed a reshuffled government that it faced real war from the outside. Correspondingly, the regime hardened and widened its military response to the opposition, culminating in the Gaza attack when rebel positions began to encroach upon and threaten Damascus. Nearing the summer of 2011, the regime released jihadi Salafist prisoners. Many of them joined and led, some went on to lead, and some of the armed groups that became active in 2012. Reinforced by foreign jihadists who mostly joined Jabhat al-Nusra and then ISIS, the insurgency steadily gained a jihadist Salafist character, marginalising non-Islamists or more moderate fighting groups directly or loosely associated with the Free Syrian Army and the Syrian national conflict. Now, my good colleague at King's College London, Dr. Reinhard Lenders, has written extensively on this issue, on how the regime benefited from the sectarianisation of the conflict. And he has suggested that it allegedly spared foreign-dominated jihadist Salafist groups in its onslaught against the rebels generally across Syria. And it's too early to make them come to argue that conclusively, perhaps. But as it reportedly collaborated with Jabhat al-Nusra in allowing the transport of oil from areas under the armed group's control in the northeast to regime-held territories. The regime also appears to have spared ISIS headquarters from their intense bombing campaign on rebel-held areas in Raqqa in the autumn of 2013. Think about how significant that is for the course the civil war has taken since that point. Lenders argues that these tactics, of course, paid considerable dividends, helped the regime mobilise and bind most of the Alawi community to it, just as it made many Christians opt for what they saw as the lesser of two evils. It provided a growing distraction from the protesters' initial socio-economic demands for regime change to overhaul 50 years of authoritarian, nearly 50 years of authoritarian rule. It helped marshal and provided a logic and a rationale for Iran and Hezbollah to intervene behind the regime, as they had good reasons to counter the jihadist Salafist current with Iran's investments in Lebanon. And it resonated with Moscow's own problems with radical jihadist activism, helping ensure that Russia, when the time came, put its full weight behind the regime, and it significantly complicated and ultimately discouraged European and US options to support the rebels militarily and generally, the moderate rebels. On the economic front, Assad acted to alleviate economic pain in regime-held areas caused by the end of the social contract after the war breaks out. Significantly, he also manipulates the provision of international aid, successfully controlling UN and international NGO activity in rebel-held areas. And it hijacked the UN aid programme, using it as a vehicle by which to enhance its domestic and international legitimacy. The Syrian state became synonymous with the Syrian government as a sovereign state actor, facilitated by UN engagement, a far cry from what was being said about the regime in 2011, 12, 13 and early parts of 2014. Russian intervention then comes in 2015, which is at least as much to do with geostrategic concerns as it was a rebuttal of the West's approach to state sovereignty in the region and in the developing world, something that is contingent then on how governments behave towards their own populations. Moscow rejected the idea that the West should be able to intervene anywhere, wherever the government was not doing what it wanted. And Moscow was also upset by the West's intervention in Libya, forcing regime change, and this played out in the Syrian civil war. Furthermore, not only did the Islamists hobble their secular rivals in 2014, the Syrian opposition's Western supporters came to be much more concerned about who was going to contain and defeat the rogue Islamists than they were about who was going to topple Assad. Inadvertently, these developments placed the regime back in the camp of those allied to the cause of maintaining the state system in the Middle East in the face of Sunni-Shia conflict and a pan-Sunni Salafist threat in Syria and Iraq, which had by this stage was spreading elsewhere. 2014, with the support of Iran and Hezbollah, the regime maintained its position in Syria's key cities. Whenever, at the time, if you remember, the war was turning in the opposite direction, it was under intense pressure. And the Alawi-dominated coastal strip, having accepted de facto Kurdish autonomy and the loss of vast swathes of territory to Islamists and the Free Syrian Army. The regime's external patrons provided the support necessary to prevent it from losing the war, culminating in Russia's game-changing 2015 military intervention. Conversely, the regime's international opponents had failed to follow up their anti-Assad rhetoric with hard political and military power. The West had no appetite for the sort of intervention that saw it overthrow Gaddafi in 2011, essentially focusing its efforts on international diplomacy and humanitarian aid while providing limited support for the FSA. Crucially, during the early years of the Civil War, the West failed to garner enough international support to push through penalising and stringent UN security resolutions in the UN against Syria, while failing to nurture and develop its fractious opposition movement into an inclusive, representative and effective alternative to the regime. One defining feature of the early civil war years is that while the regime remained homogenous, cohesive and resilient, the opposition, rather than coalescing and consolidating, seemed to become ever more heterogeneous, divided, and questionable in terms of its representation on the ground. In contrast to the FAC's meagre resources, the regime had an arsenal of weapons at its disposal, almost all of which it was prepared to use, including chemical weapons. An army of over 220 with similar numbers of reservists, not all of which it could trust, of course, official and unofficial pro-government militias, Shabiya, and military support from Iran and Hezbollah before the Russians entered the fray. Not only did the Western-backed Syrian opposition fail to organise politically, and in the absence of the support required to defeat the regime, it appeared increasingly irrelevant then after 2014 as al-Nusra and ISIS make the sweeping gains across these two states. Having recognised the Syrian National Coalition as a legitimate representative of the Syrian people in late 2012, the West did succeed in getting it to attend the Geneva II conference on Syria in 2014, which UN Arab League Special Envoy to Syria, Lakhdar Brahimi, presided over. In the absence, however, of a robust mandate from the international community and from the UN Security Council, Brahimi's political process lacked teeth. And of course, things have changed today, which is good. There was, at that time, no UN subtle diplomacy between the capitals of Moscow, Tehran, Riyadh, Damascus or Beirut, and there was no Western recognition that to end the civil war in such a deeply divided society, with a kaleidoscope of international and regional conflicts being fought out and played out and on its soil, there had to be a way out for the Alawi community under a regime that viewed the civil war in zero-sum terms and was prepared to fight to the destruction of Syria and to the last Alawi soldier. Opportunities were certainly missed in the 2012-14 period, but by the time the Geneva II talks occurred, the regime was under no great pressure to compromise, and the Syrian National Council did not have a sufficient mandate from the Syrian people or the strength on the ground to make it a challenging or robust negotiating partner. Had the opposite been true, then Islamists would not have had the military and financial backing with which to fill the vacuum in Syria. But don't forget, this was the state's, this was the regime's objective. More than that, with no expectation of any significant progress, increasingly so, fearful of homegrown jihadis returning from the war to conduct terror attacks in their cities, the focus of many Western diplomats and politicians in attendance at Geneva II had shifted to fighting extremism, which also deeply concerned the Russians given their problems in the rebellious North Caucasus. Confident that the opposition was too divided to compromise, the regime widened its political traction by attending the Geneva II talks, while growing Western apprehension over the latent Islamist threat reinforced the regime's sectarian discourse. Up until 2014, if you recall, the energy of the international actors in terms of money, arms and fighters being poured into Syria by Assad's supporters and detractors, aside from the catastrophic humanitarian refugee disaster caused by the civil war, had actually caused remarkably little spillover in terms of violence into neighbouring states or into Europe. During 2014, this order is reversed when ISIS goes on the offensive, capturing the cities of Fallujah and Mosul, attacking the Lebanese army in Hezbollah on the border town of Arsal, and attempting to capture the strategic Kurdish town of Kobani on the western border with Turkey. And this led to the sort of intervention that the Free Syrian Army had been crying out for all along, only not against the regime, but against the Islamist forces. One question for the future is whether the Assad regime will have the capacity or the interest to block a deal at the next Geneva, or this Geneva, if Iran and Russia eventually decide to attempt to broker a settlement into the conflict. We're not quite at that point, but there is an opportunity there, perhaps. So to conclude, as I'm out of time, the future of Syria remains linked, and in some ways, the short to medium-term future to the Assad regime. There's no credible pro-regime alternative, it seems. It remains hostage to Bashar's realpolitik approach to a zero-sum conflict that transcends Syria's borders, the outcome of which will have great significance for the future power balance in the region. The geographical and political constitution of a post-civil war Syria remains uncertain. Neither a political nor a military solution to its multifaceted conflicts is presently certain, although there is a stalemate and there is a balance and there is a recognition between Russia and the United States that was not there during Geneva II, which of course is good. Thus, the changes that Syria has experienced politically, socially, geographically, culturally, in terms of identity, over the course of the last 5.5 years, are salient, as the Arab nationalist, secular, and integrationist state-building project of Hafez al-Assad lie in ruins. The Syrian civil war has activated sectarian and ethnic boundaries. Existing religious, cultural, and social modes of intercommunal coexistence have been antagonized, broken, and fragmented within this deeply divided society, and this will prove enduring. Thank you.